57talk.com. Gary Cubetta back from Scottsdale, Arizona. It's a Wednesday night, and my pleasure to once again reintroduce for the upteenth time the great Larry Matysik. Larry, great to have you back.
As we dig into the history, and hopefully we're making it kind of interesting, because remember, there wouldn't be today if there wasn't yesterday.
Larry, did you notice how I announced that season 3 would be the final season of 57talk.com? Did you see that?
You scared me. How come?
You know what's funny is even my harshest critics have been emailing me saying, "Tell me it ain't so." So I don't know. That's maybe they enjoy ripping me to shreds, and not so much you because you're one of the cornerstones of the business, but me for sure. But well, anyway, we'll discuss that later, Larry. Let's get back to 1960. And
okay.
We're in the summer. Now, did Sam have the break in the summer back then?
Yes, he did. The year before, when he started wrestling at Chase in 1959, he did have a July show. But in 1960, he picked up with that no house shows in July. He still did have TV. The wrestling at the Chase was ongoing. And before we go into that, let me bring up something, because I got a quick email from a friend of ours, Harry White, longtime fan in St. Louis, relatively the same age as me. He may be older, I can't remember. But remember we talked about, and those who heard it, we talked about the great commercial Joe Garagiola did on wrestling at the Chase, and it may actually have been here in the 60s, I can't remember the date, where either Tairo Miyake or Kinji Shibuya came in and talked about Ichiban, Bushy Bavarian beer. And I was thinking it was Miyake. Joe Garagiola thinks it's Kinji Shibuya. In Harry's memory, he thinks that he remembers Miyake saying Bushy Bavarian beer, and he thinks maybe it was Kinji who said Ichiban first. And when you think back to those things, Gary, they were a tag team, so it would make a sense that they both talked at different times, probably spread it out, where maybe one of them said Bushy Bavarian beer, and the other one was saying, so Ichiban, Ichiban. So somehow we may have solved the mystery of Joe Garagiola's greatest commercial on wrestling at the Chase.
Now, back in 1960, did you watch this on like a plasma TV or one of these LCD shops?
Let's try a black and white, probably 12-inch, 14-inch, something like that. The show was in black and white, of course.
Big curve on the screen, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, God. It was a different world. But keep in mind, it was all we had, and it was kind of miraculous at those times. 1960, television had been here for a while, obviously. But still, it was kind of an amazing thing. And because there weren't nearly as many channels, one show, be it on a network or on a strong independent like KPLR TV was in St. Louis, one show could really capture the imagination, and it reached a lot of people. And, of course, wrestling at the Chase did that.
Okay, now we start to see here, July 2nd, 1960, some results from wrestling at the Chase, right?
Right, and at that point now I'm keeping track of everything week by week. I'm starting to be a good journalist. I'm starting to keep track of all the TV. Of course, Sam Muchnick was keeping track of it at the office as well. Little did I know that until I got to the office and saw the 3x5 cards that had every result with the time and the finish on it, just the same thing I had in a little notebook. And, of course, as we've mentioned before, those records are lost. And in July, the shows were okay, but he was dialing back. There wasn't quite the strong personalities, the real strong heavy main event people. You saw a lot of Bob Orton, Thor Hagen, Mighty Atlas, Guy Brunetti, and Joe Tangaro, a great tag team of the era. But by the time he got to the end of July into August, by the time you get into August 6th and August 13th, now all of a sudden you're seeing Gene Kiniski beating Johnny Ace Weaver. Pepper Gomez, famous name from the West Coast in particular. He also had a run here in St. Louis, a little run. He's beating Juan Sebastian. Cowboy Bob Ellis getting a win. And a newcomer to St. Louis, John Paul Henning, making his debut. Gary, we talked about Cowboy Bob Ellis. And I think I probably haven't given him the credit he deserves. And you mentioned not having seen some of these guys in their prime for the very logical and legitimate reason that you weren't born. I'll give you that.
Okay.
If you weren't born, you couldn't see him. Cowboy Bob Ellis was the prototypical babyface of the era. Big, strong guy, maybe 6'2", 6'3", probably legitimate 235, 240 pounds, non-steroid, but with a body that could tell he lifted weights. He was strong, curly black hair, handsome. All the ladies loved him. A willing bleeder. He bled as much as anybody, believe me. And he had mastered the art of selling. A babyface who sells can get a lot of sympathy because then when he makes the big comeback, he is a hero. And Cowboy Bob Ellis became a hero not just in St. Louis, but all over the country. Madison Square Garden, through Minneapolis, throughout the Midwest, through the South. Cowboy Bob Ellis was a big name. And he had one of the most memorable finishing moves with the Bulldog Headlock.
Yeah.
Even today, when I run into people, and sometimes you get talking to someone at a book signing or just a ball game or a restaurant or what have you, and one of the questions I usually ask, what holes do you remember? And if they're in their late 30s, anywhere on up from there, they might first of all say the claw, the iron claw, because they'll remember the Von Erich kids, David, Kevin, especially David with the iron claw. And the figure four leg lock will come up, and inevitably somebody will say the Bulldog Headlock. And I'll say you can't possibly remember that because Bob Ellis was a big star here in the 60s. You probably weren't born. And he'll say, and he or she will then say, oh, my dad talked about that Bulldog Headlock and how he used that on Kaniski and how he did that to Buddy Rogers. So the Bulldog Headlock and Cowboy Bob Ellis made him a big babyface star. And John Paul Henning, who did not become the national star but certainly became a St. Louis star, was getting his start in the summer of 1960 on television on wrestling at the Chase. Henning came from Hawaii. He had been a Navy SEAL, supposedly. I think he was a protege of Bobby Bruns, who was the booker for Sam Muchnick. And John Paul Henning had a real good run, both in St. Louis and in Toronto. His hold eventually, although he didn't use it here at first, that he became famous for, not quite as famous as the Bulldog Headlock, but it was certainly well known at the time, the bow and arrow submission hold. So we see some John Paul Henning here in 1960 as well.
Okay, August 18th, this is the first house show, right?
This is the first house show of Sam's new season.
1960, Kiel Auditorium, 7,180.
Not bad. The main event, well, a reuniting of the two bitter rivals from 1960, Cowboy Bob Ellis and Gene Kaniski. This one, Ellis took the victory, and it was a big win for him. And over time, I think if you looked back over how many matches they had, I'll bet over a 10 to 12-year period, they probably had 15, 16 matches. And if you added them up, I'd say Kaniski won more, but the edge was something like 8-6 or 9-7. There was enough that you never quite knew who was going to come up with that big victory at which time. In this case, it was Cowboy Bob Ellis. He beat Kaniski with, of all things, even though the Bulldog Headlock was his hold, he won with an airplane spin in 14 minutes and 58 seconds. The semifinal on the card, John Paul Henning, making it was his first Kiel Auditorium match right there. He'd been on TV a couple of times. He knocked off the Mighty Atlas in just 16 seconds. And, again, some names there from history. Rip Hoff and Pepper Gomez both getting disqualified. So an interesting opening to the season.
Okay, then we have April 20th TV, August 27th, September 3rd. Anything interesting here to comment on?
One thing, the Guy Brunetti, Joe Tangaro team, throughout the Midwest, they were sometimes known as the Brunetti brothers. In St. Louis, Joe Tangaro used his real name. And they had a little feud that got started with Rip Hawk and Rock Hunter on Wrestling at the Chase, where they had a match that almost went 30 minutes on television that ended up in both teams disqualified in the third fall. You had a match on TV on August 27th, 1960, where Rip Hawk goes against the new favorite, John Paul Henning. Hawk winning by disqualification. When Henning gets mad, throws Hawk over the top rope, it leads to disqualification. Surprisingly, on the next show on TV, when everybody would expect Henning to get a win, I guess he had to pay his dues because he lost on TV to Tyro Miyake, who was not saying Bushy Bavarian beer. And all those matches led to a show on September 16th, 1960. There was a place called the St. Louis House. It was on what is now Highway 44 and Jefferson Avenue in St. Louis. It's a church. It was about a 2,000-seat facility, and it actually was where television in 1952, 1953 on Channel 5 had been broadcast from. And rather than Sam still wasn't, they were still evolving in St. Louis and how often they were going to run Kiel Auditorium or not run Kiel Auditorium. And the St. Louis House became kind of an in-between location. And in this particular case, in the main event, Rip Hawk and Rock Hunter won 2 out of 3 falls from Joe Tangaro and Guy Brunetti. And, of course, Hawk and Hunter were the Blonde Bombers. When Hawk wasn't with Kaniski in a tag team, he'd be with Rock Hunter. And this question was also brought up, too. Hawk didn't use the atomic drop in all his matches. We talked about the jump off the top rope. And it is correct, as Harry White mentioned to me, Rip Hawk used the reverse neck breaker for most of his victories, and the atomic drop coming off the top rope or the second rope was something he started evolving with a little bit later, or when there was a big issue. It was the reverse neck breaker for Rip Hawk and Rock Hunter both.
So were you at this show?
I did not go to the St. Louis House show. At that time, I don't think I knew how to find it. I don't think my dad knew how to find it. Hey, we were Illinois kids. It took us a while. It was a big deal just to get to Kiel Auditorium.
Okay, let's see. We're going to go September 17th TV taping.
Interesting show, and some interesting names on it, because in one feature on TV, you have Cowboy Bob Ellis beating Bob Orton, and a lot of fans who do their history would look back and find out that Bob Orton was in a few main events at Madison Square Garden as a tag team partner with Buddy Rogers. So Orton was a big name, but the other match on the card, the NWA champion Pat O'Connor went against Rip Hawk, one of the biggest heels in St. Louis at the time. Hawk was counted out outside the ring, but again, it brought up the fact how Sam so much liked to have those competitive main event style matches, or just a notch under those main event style matches on television, that the people would really get into that. So here you had Cowboy Bob Ellis and Bob Orton on TV. More importantly, the NWA champion Pat O'Connor with Rip Hawk, and nobody could really quite figure out who was going to win or how it was going to happen.
Now, you have a comment here about Sam and Bobby Bruns, who was the booker, getting familiar with TV, because TV's in its infancy, at least local TV.
Certainly at this level, yeah. And quite often, the times weren't choreographed so tight. I'm sure there was a lot of go when it's right. And several times on matches, you would see a standby match. The last match would come on, all of a sudden would be, and in a standby match, one fall with a 6-minute time limit.
Now, Larry, the shows were 90 minutes then, right?
Well, they were 1 hour at this point. They would become 90 minutes a bit later.
Okay.
Right now we were 1 hour shows. But sometimes that last match would have this weird time limit, and it would be because they were a standby match, which, of course, added to the uniqueness of what was happening. Well, they mustn't have known. They had to throw in this standby match. And sometimes the main match would go so long that there wouldn't be a standby match. But at different times, as people would look through these results, if they happen to study them now, they'll see where somebody maybe who wrestled in the first match all of a sudden popped up wrestling a second time in a fifth match on a card, which was very unusual, but that was because somebody got a victory or whatever happened fast, and therefore they had to have a standby match.
Standby match.
They learned.
A lot of the promotions used in the 1970s.
That is correct.
Right. Okay, September 24th, October 1st TV, anything from that?
Just again, solid cards. You have Kenji Shibuya beating Thor Hagen, Frank Townsend making his debut here, masked man by the name of the Black Secret making his debut against Doug Lindsay, who later wrestled under the name of Doug Gilbert and was part of a very popular tag team throughout the Midwest. Again, all being on Wrestling at the Chase, and all of this leading to October the 7th, 1960 at Kiel Auditorium.
Attendance 8,752 as Cowboy Bob Ellis goes against Kenji Shibuya.
And he beats Kenji Shibuya with the Bulldog headlocks. You can see Ellis is getting a lot of main events. He's winning. The crowds are good. And the co-feature was between Wilbur Snyder, who was well known in St. Louis, hadn't been on TV that much, although he had beaten Tyro Miyake on TV October 1st of 1960. Snyder comes back to go head-to-head with Gene Kiniski. The match ruled a no contest. Both men bleeding, both men disqualified. I even see my little note here. It says I was sitting in mezzanine, section 5, row A, seats 5 and 6. I must have liked those seats to write the tickets down. It was probably one of the few times, for those who studied the career of Gene Kiniski, and for that matter, Wilbur Snyder, that either bled that much. They really were not bleeders, where Ellis would bleed pretty easily. Snyder and Kiniski really didn't. But in this one, they both were bleeding, and they had literally a knockdown, drag-out, back alley brawl, and both men were disqualified.
I remember Wilbur Snyder from the late 70s, early 80s, and kind of slow. How was he in the early 60s?
He was a stud. He was one of the guys in 1959, just a hair behind O'Connor, Pat O'Connor, who got the belt, and Vern Gagne, who wanted the belt. And a lot of people thought that title in 1959 should have gone to Wilbur Snyder. In the 50s, he'd had a couple of great matches with Lou Thesz. He was a terrific athlete. And certainly at this point in his career, he was a hungry, excellent athlete. And over the 60s, you would find him settling down a notch. He became involved in the promotion in Indianapolis, became a partner with Dick the Bruiser running that promotion probably by the late 60s. And Wilbur, by that point, knew he was no longer going to be champion. Age was maybe costing him a step in the ring, and he was that good guy in the middle of the card, once again, to help teach, to learn, and have a good reputation. He added quality, I guess is the word you would want to look for to a card. At this point, though, Wilbur Snyder, most people thought could well have been the world champion, and they looked at him as a legitimate challenger for Pat O'Connor, whoever had the NWA belt.
Okay, October 8th, TV taping, John Paul Hennig draw with Stan Stasiak. What was Stan like in 1960?
Young and green and aggressive. And here were two young guys, Stan Stasiak and John Paul Hennig, battling to a draw, a strong match. Gene Kiniski back beating Frank Townsend, who was a pretty big name at that time. Yeah. He had a good rep in certain parts of the Midwest and up in the Northeast around Buffalo, Toronto area. Plus, on that same TV, you had Wilbur Snyder going to draw with Kenji Shibuya. So once again, here's that competitive aspect that Sam Muchnick likes so much for wrestling at the Chase. John Paul Hennig, Stan Stasiak a draw, Kiniski beating Frank Townsend, Rip Hawk, Rock Hunter winning a tag match, plus Wilbur Snyder and Kenji Shibuya. That's a pretty strong TV.
Yeah, for sure.
October. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Excuse me, Larry. Yeah.
Well, that's okay. I was just going to jump at one because I didn't mark it, and I probably should have. The next TV, October 15th, and this is probably what you were going to mention.
Yeah, Buddy Rogers.
Buddy Rogers,
yeah.
First time on Wrestling at the Chase. And Rogers, if we talk about Cowboy Bob Ellis as the quintessential babyface of the era, trust me, Buddy Rogers was the heel of the era. Nobody could get heat like Buddy Rogers, and I mean serious, we hate you, we want your brains beaten out heat. He was arrogant, he knew how to sell it, he could put it across in the ring, he was athletic enough, and this is a guy who'd been headlining cards since the late 1940s. If you want to look into the history of wrestling, when Buddy Rogers jumped from the old Tom Pax Alliance, the old Trust promotion, to the new fangled Sam Muchnick promotion in 1949, that, along with the formation of the National Wrestling Alliance, was what tipped the scale in the battle. That's what put Sam Muchnick over the top. And Sam always remembered that with Buddy Rogers, even though Sam always told me, he says, Rogers was horrible to do business with. He says, I hated him. He was just an absolute pain in the butt. He says, but you know what? When you're doing business, you can't let that bother you. I don't have to go out and eat with him. I don't have to be buddy-buddy with him. I just have to do business with him. So he brought Buddy Rogers in because he knew Buddy Rogers meant money.
Well, you must have talked to Sam about it. You mentioned it, but give me some details. What made Buddy so difficult to deal with? Did he hold up for bigger paydays, or was you complaining?
Sometimes on paydays, sometimes on finishes, he would balk. He would also rely back quite often to whichever promotion he was with, which at one time was a gentleman by the name of Al Haft out of Ohio. Later became, in a very short period of time, right after the 1960 era we're talking about, he would rely a lot on not only Vince McMahon Sr., but the brains behind Vince McMahon Sr. in the early 60s, Toots Mondt, who was a famous name in wrestling history, once a wrestler, later a promoter, booker, a real manipulator, a total shyster, and Sam and him were always battling, and they loved each other, but they were also on the opposite side of fights. And a lot of times Buddy Rogers would, well, Mondt says I can't do that, McMahon says I can't do that. No, I can't take that date. I can only take that date if I get that money. Every step of the way, even booking dates with him, from Sam's perspective, was just difficult. It was always, well, I could take this date. No, I can go to Chicago that night. No, I can go to Newark, New Jersey that night. I don't know, can we get a guarantee? It was just pulling teeth from Sam Muchnick's perspective. But he drew money, so Sam pulled teeth.
Now, looking back at it, how would Buddy do today in today's wrestling? Would he transfer over?
Well, physically he would be overmatched because he wouldn't be as big and he wouldn't be all steroided up. I guess he'd have to take steroids. His mentality, his charisma, his ability to work a crowd, I think would still be there. But, it's hard. You're doing apples and oranges. You'd have to understand that if a Buddy Rogers came along today, they might not allow him to be Buddy Rogers because Buddy was one of a kind back in that era. And right now I think pretty much everybody's alike unless they give him something like Kane, some sort of goofy angle like that. But if he were allowed to run and his mentality were there, and obviously some of his style would have to change as far as in the ring, but that's like saying, would Mario Wills be a force in baseball today? Would he really be able to run that much and steal that much? Well, it would depend on what he learned for the business. The mentality of Buddy Rogers in learning how to get heat, that would get over. And it would probably be a shock to a lot of people how intense that heat would be, because believe me, I was in that audience, and I saw the intensity of the heat that people have with Buddy Rogers, and we'll be seeing that here as we go into 61, 62, 63 matches with people like Johnny Valentine and John Paul Henning.
Okay, October 22 TV taping, Danny Hodge, junior heavyweight champion.
Yep, making his St. Louis debut, although he may have been here once or twice right before TV started, but this was Sam putting Dan Hodge on Wrestling at the Chase in a main position, beating a gentleman by the name of Carlos Rodriguez, who was a local ham and egger, for lack of a better term. And Hodge was really the key guy on the show, even though Wilbur Snyder was on it, John Paul Henning was on it. But he wanted to show Danny Hodge, and it's kind of curious. We'll see how he is used over the next 4, 5, 6, 7 months. Sam really tried to keep him separate, couldn't keep him separate because this was such a heavyweight town. Yet he knew that if he put him against the main heavyweights, that wasn't fair to Hodge. Yet there was nobody at Hodge's size with whom he could draw money. So it was kind of a difficult place to put him. But as NWA president, and with Danny Hodge being the NWA junior heavyweight champion, I think he felt it was important to have Dan Hodge on shows here just to let people know that the junior heavyweight division did exist and that Dan Hodge was a terrific performer.
October 26, 1960, Kiel Auditorium, billed as the first ever Super Spectacular.
And an attendance of 12,459, standing room sellout to see a double main event, Buddy Rogers against the newcomer, John Paul Henning. Buddy Rogers winning, by the way, with a pile driver. The return match between Wilbur Snyder and Gene Kiniski, which Snyder won when Kiniski landed a knee drop on the throat, which was an automatic disqualification. Kiniski having a conniption fit afterwards, claiming that he did not land on the throat, that he aimed for the chest, and Snyder had moved. The idea that it was called a Super Spectacular was that Sam had girls on the card, he had midgets on the card, he had a six-man on the card, there was more matches. Probably, I guess you could look at it as an early pay-per-view spectacular. But at that time, they billed it as a Super Spectacular. And Gory Guerrero, Doug Lindsay, and George Drake winning for Rip Hawk, Rock Hunter, and The Black Secret. Lord Littlebrook beating Tiny Rowe. Judy Glover and Jessica Rogers over Lorraine Johnson and Kathy Starr. An opening match of Frank Townsend and Kinji Shibuya, who was also main eventer, going to a draw. It was a strong, strong card.
Okay, October 29th, 1960 TV taping, Gene Kiniski versus John Paul Hennig.
And they go to a time limit draw. I'm looking at the notes right now, a 15-minute time limit draw. So even though Henning lost at Kiel Auditorium a couple nights before to Buddy Rogers in a good close match, but Rogers won clean, it was a typical, beautiful buildup of a young piece of talent. He came so close to beating a top star, but he hasn't quit. Here he is in here with Gene Kiniski, who most people at that time thought was, and correctly thought, was pretty close to Buddy Rogers. Here he is on TV going to draw with Gene Kiniski. So, again, just part of that wise, smart, careful, patient booking of a young piece of talent who you believe you can draw some money with.
Okay, November 5th, TV taping, Buddy Rogers over George Drake.
John Paul Henning beat Stan Stasiak. Remember when they had a draw before? Now all of a sudden Henning has wrestled him again and beaten him.
Yep.
He must be improving. And there's a name on November 12th that some folks today would recognize. That first match, Joe Hamilton, one of the assassins, who became one of the assassins and has written a book, and one of the bookers and one of the trainers for WWF and WCW over the years. Here he is on St. Louis television, November 12th, 1960.
No mask, obviously, right?
Nope, just Joe Hamilton.
Now, NWA champion Pat O'Connor defeats the Black Secret, who was unmasked as Mike Padusis.
Padusis was a terrific collegiate athlete from Tennessee. He played both football and wrestled. So the hope was Padusis could get over a little bit stronger. He really never got to that main event position. But again, here we are on St. Louis television, the NWA champion putting his title up against the mask, in a match where the masked man is beaten and unmasked.
Yeah.
Once again, why did St. Louis Wrestling at the Chase get over with the crowd? Once again, there's one of those little tricks that's just right. They knew by that point the Black Secret was not going to be a superstar. Well, let's get value out of him. He's a terrific wrestler. He'll have a great match with O'Connor, which he did. O'Connor wins it. Black Secret unmasked, which also helps prove the thing about masked men from Sam Muchnick's position. If the masked man loses by pin or submission, he will unmask and reveal his identity.
Wow. Okay. November 18th, 1960, Kiel Auditorium, 11,044.
And Cowboy Bob Ellis gets another crack at Pat O'Connor. Remember, he lost that one fall match to him back in February. Sam always was patient. Here was the return match going 2 out of 3 falls, and O'Connor wins it. Let me look and see if we can get exactly how the falls went. I believe it was a first and third fall split. That's exactly right. Yep, there it is. So bottom line was Ellis took him to the limit. He'd been winning, but he couldn't quite take the belt from Pat O'Connor. Done right, you still got Ellis over very strongly. You've proven that Pat O'Connor is a legitimate and deserving champion. So once more, they've told the story. And, of course, Buddy Rogers right underneath. At that point, I forgot to mention, Buddy Rogers, when he came to town, was billed as the United States champion. And that all tied into that whole egotistical, political, personal battle games that you had to play, the head games you had to play with Buddy Rogers and Toots Mondt and Al Haft and Vince McMahon Sr. and everybody else just to get Buddy Rogers in town. In this case, Buddy Rogers beat Frank Townsend, who hadn't lost anybody, so it meant something for Rogers to beat Townsend. And a pretty strong card underneath it. You had Whipper Billy Watson and John Paul Henning winning 2 straight falls from Tyrone Miyake and Gene Kiniski.
Yeah.
The first by disqualification, second fall when Henning beats Miyake, and there's Danny Hodge beating Rock Hunter. Good spot on the card. So once more, a very strong house show, and of course it drew 11,044 people.
Larry, when we were in St. Louis, I got the chance to tour the outside of the Kiel Auditorium with Bill Apter, who was showing me where the wrestlers had gotten into the arena. Did you, when you would go, did you get a chance to see the guys ever before the?
Eventually, I started going over. I figured out where the dressing room door was, and actually, by the time I kind of figured it out, by then I was already had been. This was in 1963. I'd already been called in to see Sam, and we'd made a connection. So at that point, hanging out there was not something that really I should do. And one of the early things Sam told me, and we're jumping ahead a year or two, and we talked about this a little, but, don't be a hero worshiper, and something he emphasized over and over and over. They're all just human beings. Everybody has feet of clay. Let's remember that.
Yeah. Okay. November.
But that's kind of an amazing fact, because the actual dressing room entrance to Kiel Auditorium still exists because part of that old building is still there. In fact, they're going to begin renovation of the part where you were, Gary. That part in the Opera House, they're going to begin renovation this week. They just got the bonds passed and got money for it, and so finally they're going to renovate the Opera House side, which includes all the dressing rooms for what was then wrestling. They used the dressing rooms on that side of the building and went into what was called the convention hall, which is where wrestling was.
It seemed to me to be it's like a very compact building, in that a lot of times you go into an arena and from the front to where the guys came in, really wasn't that far away, was it?
Well, when they came from the dressing room to the ring, it was a long way. In fact, the guys always talked about how long that was, and dangerous sometimes when the crowd was hot, because you never knew.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. You'd asked me last time when we talked a couple of days ago about 1959, what my feelings were and how everything looked and it felt to me. And Harry White wrote, and it kind of reminded me of this. Harry said, "The aura of Kiel with that smoke swirling under the ring lights, like fog rolling in from the moors, is a sight I will always recall from a young person's view." And it kind of sparked that memory in me that even then, and even up till the end, because by the time I was working for Sam full-time, I was probably one of the first 3 or 4 people in the building. I'd always stop in there and look. And most of the lights would be out, but the ring lights would be on. And that mat cover was white. Nowadays, mostly it's off blue or something because there's so much television, but that mat cover was white. And it was like a diamond sitting in the middle of this little area. And, of course, when it got smoky, it did look like the fog rolling in. Of course, in that era, in the 60s, everybody smoked God knows how much secondhand smoke I swallowed back in that building back in the 60s.
Yeah.
But the building itself was compact, and in fact, I don't believe they can build arenas or auditoriums this way. There are legalities against it. The balcony hung over what was the mezzanine section. So if you were in the front rows of the front balcony, you probably were no more than 30 yards away from the wrestling. You were right above the ringside people looking right into that ring. And those front rows of the front balcony were awesome, but I don't think they can make auditoriums like that anymore. There's something to do with the pitch of the building and the way people walk, so they don't allow that balcony type area. Kiel Auditorium was just it was a compact and intimate building. The only thing was there was that long walk from the dressing room door to the ring, and I'll bet that was at almost 100 yards.
So it wasn't my imagination. When you went inside, it was in fact compact, right?
Oh, yes, and in fact, underneath, you had the convention hall on one side, which is where wrestling was, seated close to 11,000 people, give or take, depending how it was set up and depending if they allowed standing room only at different periods in time. That backed into the Opera House. They actually shared a stage where a steel curtain would be dropped down between the two so that you could have both venues being used the same night, and you wouldn't hear any noise from one side to the other. You could, in certain cases, bring that steel curtain up and open up that stage, which would be very odd. But the Opera House side is seated probably, 3,000, 3,500. Underneath was a basement called the Exposition Hall. And I don't know if you saw the steps perhaps to the side of the dressing room doors. Those steps went underneath, and there would be nights where there might be an auto show in the Exposition Hall, the opera in the Opera House side, and professional wrestling in the Convention Hall side. Talk about a traffic jam afterwards. What a mess.
Well, Larry, I was very fortunate. We went to St. Louis for the Mike Palermo show, the Super Show, and I got to meet you, which was a pleasure. And Darla Taylor, right?
Correct.
Took us on a wonderful tour that we all coordinated with Bill Apter and myself, and it was wonderful to see Kiel and then go for a tour in St. Louis and see some of the other sites. And as I mentioned in the first part of 1960, the Corazon Room, which you could feel the ghosts of wrestling past. Indeed. Did
Darla tell you that she was there the night that Pat O'Connor won the title from Dick Hutton? Didn't know she was that old, did you?
No, she didn't tell me, no.
Well, she said 9 months old and sitting on her mother's lap. So she really didn't remember much about the match. But she was there January 9th, 1959. And once again, I mentioned that strictly to bring up one more time, and it's true not just in St. Louis. I think it's true in a lot of cities all over the country, all over Canada. There's that family connection. If mom and dad went, or a brother went, or an uncle went, somehow it all kind of fit together. And once you discovered it, even though some people might want to look down their noses at it, in the end they didn't. They found something to love in wrestling and some way to have a great night's entertainment.
Absolutely. Okay, now where we did November
18th.
Did we do that?
Yes, we did.
Now, November 19th TV, Buddy Rogers defeats Rock Hunter.
And gets involved in a brawl with Rip Hawk, who's at ringside. Now, remember, Rogers was a bad guy. Rip Hawk and Rock Hunter were bad guys who were tag team partners. In this case, Rogers beat Hunter with the figure four leg lock, kept putting the pressure on, brought Hawk to the ring. Hawk attacked Rogers. They had a knockdown drag out. Joe Garagiola went crazy because here's Rip Hawk and Buddy Rogers, the two of the biggest heels of the era in St. Louis, going nose to nose. By the way, I see Joe Hamilton's on that card losing to Mike Padusis. And if you look at that, remember we talked about standby matches? First match on the card, Sonny Myers and Mike Padusis go to a draw. Second match, John Paul Henning beats Thor Hagen in a scientific match, and I'm looking for the time on that. Yeah, they went almost 13 minutes. Then you have Buddy Rogers and Rock Hunter. They only go 30 seconds before all heck breaks loose. After the figure four leg lock, Hawk and Rogers have a brawl. Standby match, Mike Padusis comes back again against Joe Hamilton and pins him in 12 minutes. So once again, something happened that wasn't quite expected to happen that way, and yet, because it did happen that way, made it all that much more exciting because here were the two of the biggest heels, Buddy Rogers and Rip Hawk, both blonde bombers, nose to nose and going at it.
December 2nd, 1960, Kiel Auditorium.
And, of course, Buddy Rogers goes in the main event against Rip Hawk, 10,550. Didn't quite sell out, but I'll tell you, that's not a bad house. I'm sure Sam was not unhappy with it. And Hawk gets beat by Buddy Rogers. And that I do remember because Hawk tried to come off the top rope on Rogers. Rogers rolled away. Hawk missed the dive from the top rope. Rogers just rolled over and cradled him for the pin. So he didn't destroy Rip Hawk, and in fact, we'll see that match pop up over the next year again. And how was the crowd split? I was there. Probably they were more for Rip Hawk. Buddy Rogers just had that aura around him. They didn't like him. And in this case, because Rip Hawk was also arguing with Joe Garagiola, and they were kind of into that little argument, and which sometimes had a lot of humor, I think they were, I would say it was 75-25 people rooting for Rip Hawk against Buddy Rogers.
Larry, what were ticket prices like back then?
Oh, wow. I think it was a $3 tops on regular shows and a $4 tops for the world title.
So three?
The economy was slightly different.
Well, yeah, a lot of things were different. Was it hard to get the $3, or was it easy? Or
ringside all sells. It's pretty much traditionally been that your ringside seats, they pretty much go fast.
But for you to like.
Oh, in those days? Well, I was to the point then I was ordering tickets as soon as they went on sale. And I really wasn't trying to get ringside because we learned those mezzanine seats, which were kind of raised underneath the back. I wanted either front balcony or the mezzanine, and those were really at ring level. Those were great seats to see, and when the crowd would jump up and be milling about, you didn't have to worry about being blocked from what was going on. And might mention that December 2nd card.
Okay.
Because I like the six-man tag match. Cowboy Bob Ellis beats Mike Paducas in one match. But listen to this team. Listen to who's involved in this match.
Okay.
Sonny Myers, John Paul Henning, and Dan Hodge against Rock Hunter, Tyro Miyake, and Johnny Valentine, returning to St. Louis, and he hadn't been here since probably 57, 58. Interesting in that you have Johnny Valentine, one of the famed shooters of the era, one of the same tough guys, across from Dan Hodge, one of the most traditionally known tough guys in the ring, too. So that's an interesting six-man tag, 2 out of 3 falls. Hunter beats Henning, Henning beats Hunter, Sonny Myers beats Tyro Miyake. So Valentine and Hodge weren't even involved in the fall. But it did expose Valentine here, and he was going to become, over the next little bit of time, become one of the top players in the game right here, too. He'd always been a main event figure in St. Louis, and now he's going to get a chance to go on Wrestling at the Chase on television.
Okay, what date? December 3rd? No?
Well, yeah, we did December 2nd. The TV's good there, but the TV for the rest of 1960, there's a couple interesting things there, plus Sam ran another St. Louis house show on December 16th.
Oh, yeah, December 16th. Okay.
Remember Rip Hawk and Rock Hunter had been main event winners in the first St. Louis house show, and they beat Tangaro and Brunetti. On this one, they came back against John Paul Henning and Frank Townsend. Henning and Frank Townsend won that night. But the TV was interesting because things were happening, and I particularly point to December 17th, 1960, and the building of a young babyface again. You see the match I mean, right, Gary?
John Paul Hennig, Pat O'Connor, yeah.
The NWA champion gets in the ring with John Paul Henning. Now, Henning's kind of established, is right on that verge of a solid main eventer. He took Buddy Rogers to the hilt. He's had a draw with Gene Kiniski. Now he gets a match on TV, biggest possible audience, with the NWA champion, Pat O'Connor. People were probably expecting, there'll be another match on the show. This match will end in a pin. Henning will give it a good run. There'll be a fourth match on the show. No, they went 30 minutes to a draw to the very end of the show, once again helping to establish Henning as a major player in the game. So, beautiful build, and again, Henning had to have the goods. The other thing I would say about John Paul Henning, who's kind of been forgotten over the years.
Yeah, because I've heard of his name from way back, but I can't. You're talking about him, and I just can't picture anything. He's not related to Larry Hennig or Kurt Hennig.
No, totally different. And He spells it Henning, Henning. Right. John Paul Henning was a lousy interview. He would have had trouble today with doing promos. Of course, they'd have probably tried to script him, and that would have screwed him up even more. But he wasn't a great talker at the time. The ironic thing is that after he got out of wrestling, and he was involved in a couple of very bad car wrecks and had some health issues, he became a preacher. Much like Tully Blanchard and Ted DiBiase, and we seem to have had a run of those lately. John Paul Henning became a preacher, and he went around the 10th Circuit preaching. So obviously he did learn how to talk eventually, but in 1960 he wasn't the strongest talker. It was the action in the ring. I think there were some political problems in terms of booking him certain places, but where they used him, which was Toronto and St. Louis in particular, he did very well, and he was a solid main event guy. And in the last two shows on TV of Wrestling at the Chase in 1960, there's Hennig with a win over Mike Padusis, who is the unmasked Black Secret, with a win over Stan Stasiak again, proving that the first time they met was not a fluke. He'd wrestled Stasiak once to draw, and now he'd beaten him twice. And take a look at that New Year's Eve, 1960 TV, because that's an interesting one, especially, again, from historic standards. Hennig beats Stasiak. Fritz von Erich returns to St. Louis, beating Doug Lindsay, who was a good hand. And then in a tag team that all historians, anybody who follows wrestling should remember, shouldn't have heard the name, Buddy Rogers and Johnny Valentine. Yeah. Team up to win from Cowboy Bob Ellis and Thor Hagen in an 18-minute match, Rogers beating Hagen, but also painting a little story about Ellis with Valentine and particularly Rogers. Fritz von Erich, of course, was not going to be here for a long time. He had been a star for Sam in 56, 57, 58 without TV here in St. Louis. He was living in Fairview Heights, and that's when Kevin von Erich was born in Belleville, Illinois, a suburb here where I live, of St. Louis. He was born at the hospital here in 1957. Fritz just passing through and Sam getting a main event out of him, and certainly, again, having some very strong television shows when you have people like John Paul Hennig being Mike Padusis and Fritz von Erich being Frank Townsend, even George Drake. Well, you have to look a little bit, but those who are really deep into the history, George Drake was kind of a character and well-known, especially in the California, Hawaii areas, and he's losing to Rip Hawk on television. So lots of things were happening, and Larry was more and more learning.
Larry Fritz in 1960.
Vicious. Another heel. Right on the... He was already... He knew how to do it. But you could see there was even more, and of course he will prove that in St. Louis, again, in about 1963 on, when he comes back for another real run. Once again, remember when we talked about how... We were talking, I think, 1978-ish, 1979, how there was this generation of really explosive talent, very charismatic personalities, really starting to make their mark in wrestling, from Flair to DiBiase to the Von Erichs to Brody to Murdoch. They were really starting to hit their peak. The same thing was happening 1959, 1960, 1961. While you may have had some salty, strong, well-established names like a Buddy Rogers, like a Lou Thez, some of those people, now you all of a sudden had Ellis, Von Erich, Hennig, Kiniski really starting to put it all together. And once again, as you look back now with the benefit of hindsight, you can kind of see how it was all coming together. The TV was really clicking. Everything was right there. The talent level was really getting to a high peak. And, of course, as always, it's wrestling. There were plenty of headaches coming politically, or 61, 62, 63, and right in the middle of all those battles would be none other than Buddy Rogers, and in theory, Vince McMahon Sr. with Toots Mondt, perhaps the puppeteer behind the scenes.
I can't wait to cover it. Larry, it's been a pleasure. Thank you again, and we'll do more next week.
Sounds good to me, Gary. Thank you so much. Hope we're not boring you.
Oh, I love it. We'll talk again. Thank you, Larry.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.